Hi everyone and welcome back to another video. My name is Richard Seidlitz and I'm the owner of redpants.lol. This is another entry in my series about buying, maintaining, and ownership in general of the 2005 to 2018 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. And this video is a follow-up to my last one, which is about the manual and sport shift transmissions that are used in these cars. If you haven't watched that video yet, check out the link in the description below, as these two videos are directly related and they do reference each other. Well, in that video, I talked about the transmissions themselves, along with some do's, don'ts, tips, and tricks. This video is about maintenance, with an extra focus on your clutch, flywheel, and gear oil options. Now, even if you're not planning to maintain your car yourself, the information here is going to be worthwhile, because which clutch, flywheel, and gear oil you use can affect your shifting smoothness, your engine response, and your component longevity. So whether you're looking for driving enjoyment or vehicle performance or reliability or all the above, this video is going to have something for you. Now, during this video, I'll be talking about these topics as they relate specifically to the V8 Vantage. If you're looking for general information about gear oils and clutches and flywheels and how they work, there are tons of articles and videos out there that cover them. But this video is specifically about the effects of those things on these cars. Also, I'll be using the products that I use and sell as examples, but you're welcome to do your own research if you'd like to find other options. If you'd like to support Red Pants, please consider shopping in my online store, as those sales are what makes it possible for me to make these videos and DIY guides, not only helping to keep you informed, but also saving you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per year owning your Aston Martin. Okay, all that said, grab a drink or two and let's get started. Let's begin with gear oil. As I mentioned it in my V8 Vantage maintenance video, the gear oil, which is sometimes called transmission fluid, is a routine service item that needs to be replaced every 4 years or 40,000 miles, whichever one comes first. The original gear oil used in these cars when they were first produced was the Shell transaxle oil. However, Aston Martin got a lot of complaints about difficulty shifting between first and second gear when the transmission was cold, so they switched over to a custom blend from Castrol called BOT270A, which is what I have right here. Next to it is an aftermarket option called Motul Gear 300, which I'll also be talking about. The first step in picking a gear oil is to get the right grade, which Aston Martin specifies as 75W90 for these cars. Next, you need to make sure the gear oils you're using or considering won't damage your transmission. That typically means that those with additives specifically meant for limited slip differentials, usually denoted as LS or LSD, should not be used. Because the V8 Vantage is a transaxle, yes, the gear oil will be used for the limited slip differential. However, LS additives can damage yellow metals like those used in a transmission synchros. So a gear oil needs to be selected that's safe for both the differential and the transmission. Now, once you've got your options narrowed down to viable gear oils, there are three main things that people generally consider when making their final choice. And those are shifting, protection, and price. I'm going to use these two gear oils as examples to talk about how to decide which gear oil is right for you based on those three criteria. Now, I've already mentioned that Aston Martin switched to the Castrol BOT270A for improved shifting, but along with that came two downsides. One is that this new gear oil offers less protection than the previous one, and two is that it can be very expensive. I've seen it cost over 3 times as much as this Motul gear oil. Now, the way to figure out what's best for you is to decide which of these criteria or factors are most important for you. If you don't track your car, you just want to enjoy driving around on the streets and doing some spirited driving every once in a while, you'll want the best shifting gear oil. Now, if you drive your car hard, and especially if you track it, you're going to need a gear oil that offers more protection. Or if you want to spend as little as possible, just buy whatever's cheapest. Now, applying these three criteria to these two fluids as our example, we can say that if you want the smoothest shift, get the Castrol. And if you want the most protection, get the Motul. But for price, honestly, I hope that's not a driving factor for anyone's decision. And that's not because I sell this stuff, it's because the math behind the prices. Yes, the Castrol is significantly more expensive than the Motul is. And yes, you can spend 3 or 4 times as much on gear oil as you would on engine oil. But it's important to remember that engine oil gets replaced every single year, while gear oil only gets replaced every 4 years. So even if you get the more expensive Castrol, and even if the cost may seem high when you're doing this job, it's a job that is rarely done, and the cost isn't much different per annum as an engine oil change. And of course, all this is relative. For example, I live in Florida, so I don't really have an issue with cold shifting regardless of what gear oil I use. And yes, the Castrol will be easier to shift, but it's not like the Motul is bad in that regard in any way. Meanwhile, having less protection doesn't mean the Castrol won't have enough protection. If you pound on your car pretty hard or you do track days, I'd absolutely get the Motul, and that's what I use in my gray car. If you're just putting around town or you do some occasional spirited driving, then the Castrol will be perfectly fine, and this is what I had in my red one. There are a bunch of gear oils out there, but these are the two that I sell on Red Pants, that I use myself, and that I recommend to my customers, and my recommendations are based on those criteria and for the customer specifically how they need their gear oil to perform for their use of their car. Now, one thing before we move on is that the washers for the drain and fill plugs and the O-ring for the transmission filter should all be replaced when changing your gear oil. If any of these are reused, it's possible that you can get a leak, and it's not worth, in my opinion, risking all that gear oil just to save a few dollars on some hardware. I do sell the gear oils and the gear oil change packages on Red Pants, and I've got a DIY guide and video showing you how to do this job yourself to help you save a whole bunch of money if you want to tackle it. Next up, we have another fluid, but it's actually part of your braking system. This happens to be one of the most overlooked things that I've seen on these cars, so I highly recommend you pay attention to this part and do take heed. The clutch line for the manual transmission uses brake fluid, and it's shared with the brake fluid reservoir as the rest of the braking system. So when you bleed your brake lines, and that's generally recommended to be every 2 years, you should also bleed the clutch line for the manual transmission. Now, I've got a DIY showing how to do the brake lines, and I include a section for the clutch line. It's super easy, so don't worry about it, but definitely do it with the rest of your braking system. I've done this on several cars where the owners called me after leaving and said it felt like they had a new clutch. That's how much of a difference this can make, so don't overlook it. Now, if you have a sport shift car, this is a bit different because you've got hydraulic fluid in that line, and you shouldn't drain that if you aren't able to refill it. Now, the proper way to refill the clutch line in a sport shift car is to use an AMDS. However, those are only available at dealerships and a few indies, so it's very, very hard to find them. I've heard of ways to do it to where you can cycle the solenoids using the paddles in order to refill that clutch line. However, I don't recommend it to people because if you do it wrong, your car will not be able to move as there won't be enough pressure in that clutch line to release and re-engage that clutch, which means your car can't shift in and out of gear. So, word of warning there. But regardless, make sure you actually pay attention to your clutch lines. The hydraulic fluid lasts a much, much longer time than the brake fluid. The brake fluid is every couple of years. So make sure you do that, especially if you have a manual. Next, let's talk about clutches and flywheels. Clutches in these cars do have a very bad reputation, much of which is due to improper driving, basically doing all the things I said not to do in that previous video. There was also a faulty batch of clutches early on in the V8 Vantage production, and that did not help this reputation whatsoever. Another problem is that Aston Martin chose a somewhat inexpensive option for the OEM clutch. While yes, it works, and yes, it can last a decent number of miles if driven properly, the OEM single plate clutch doesn't hold up particularly well to abuse, and unfortunately, abuse is very common in these cars given the improper driving or the cars being hard on themselves by design, which I also talked about in that previous video. Now, Aston Martin did update the single plate clutch with a better friction material, so it's better now than it was during those earlier production years, but even so, I still highly recommend getting a twin plate clutch. Now, from this point on, I'll be referring to this group of parts as a clutch package, as this is how they're often sold, and it's just easier to say clutch package than naming the components. So in a clutch package, we've typically got a clutch, a flywheel, a slave cylinder, some bolts, possibly an exhaust manifold gasket, maybe a spacer for the slave cylinder if it's needed, and sometimes a pilot bearing. It depends on which clutch package you're getting. This is an OEM clutch package for a 4.3 liter V8 Vantage with sport shift transmission. The clutch is a single plate, which you can see by this single friction plate. Now, the 4.7 liter came with a slightly revised flywheel, which is about 1 pound lighter than this one here. It's a small difference, but it's there. Even though the 4.7 liters flywheel is lighter than that of the 4.3 liter, it isn't really a lightweight flywheel, but I'll talk more about that later. If you go with one of these clutch packages for your car, there's not really much to say. It'll just be more of the same as what you already have and what you're used to. You may notice a very slight difference with the 4.7 liters lighter flywheel if you're switching to that one from an earlier 4.3 liters, but if you want a meaningful change, you'll want to upgrade to a twin plate clutch package. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to clear things up. What I'm discussing is clutches. I just mentioned single plate clutches, and now I'm about to talk about twin plate clutches. Twin plate clutches are sometimes called dual plate clutches, and that is totally fine. However, it can lead to people shortening that term from dual plate clutch down to dual clutch, and that is totally not fine. Dual plate clutch refers to a clutch with two friction plates in it. Dual clutch refers to a transmission that has two clutches in it. There is no such thing as a Gaydon-era Aston Martin with a dual clutch transmission. So, to avoid this situation altogether, I try to stick to the term twin plate clutch, though I do sometimes say dual plate clutch as well. Okay, moving on. This here is a friction plate from a single plate clutch. A twin plate clutch has two of them, thus the name. Now, when comparing them side by side, the twin plate clutch will likely have a smaller diameter, meaning it has less surface area on a friction disc. However, because the twin plate clutch has two of them, overall it'll have more total surface area. All else being equal, the more surface area a clutch has on its friction disc or discs, the longer it will last, the more torque it can hold, and the more abuse it can withstand. Since so many Aston Martin owners are concerned about clutch life, I always recommend they upgrade to a twin plate clutch package, as that can last so much longer. Now, generally, twin plate clutch packages for these cars are going to be similar to each other. The key components will be a twin plate clutch and a lightweight flywheel along with the rest of these components. Each of these has notable differences from the standard items, so let's cover what those are and why they matter to us. Now, I already said that twin plate clutch is going to last longer and take more abuse than a single plate clutch, and that alone is reason enough for many people to switch over to one once their single plate clutch has been fried. But I've also found another benefit that I wasn't really expecting, and that is the clutch pedal gets much softer. This benefit specific to the manual transmission may actually be a little divisive. Twin plate clutches tend to have a lighter clutch pedal, which can actually be significantly lighter given how stiff the clutch pedal is with the factory single plate clutch in the V8 Vantage. For short drives, I actually do like the heavy clutch pedal because it gives some really nice feedback. But my time in the Marine Corps left me with some bad knees, so anything more than an hour or so would become a problem. Long drives would be excruciating on my knees, and I'd often have a pretty silly limp when I reached my final destination. Now, my clutch pedal got super light compared to the factory setup when I switched over to the Velocity AP twin plate clutch package in my gray V8 Vantage. My immediate initial response was that I honestly did not like it much. It felt too light, and this is why some people will not see this as a benefit and might consider it to be quite the opposite. But I did quickly get used to it over the course of a couple of weeks, and after my first long distance drive, it proved to be a wonderful change. I no longer have to worry about taking painkillers with me on road trips, and I can enjoy my car so much more without worrying about my knees. I bought a second V8 Vantage, which is my red one, after I'd been using the Velocity AP clutch setup for a couple of years, and switching back and forth between the two cars was kind of odd. My red V8 Vantage with the single plate clutch felt like a tractor, and my gray V8 Vantage with the Velocity AP clutch felt like the clutch pedal was too light, at least at first when I first got into the car. But again, it quickly became normal after pressing the clutch pedal a few times to reset my muscle memory. Now, having the two cars with the two completely different clutches for comparison side by side, without a doubt, I prefer the lighter clutch pedal in my Velocity AP setup. It's worth mentioning how different they are because it's such a big change. It'll be a huge benefit for those of us with knee problems that dread the idea of converting to the dark side and getting a flappy paddle car when we can no longer manage our knees with that stiff clutch. And lots of people end up liking the clutch pedal once they get used to it, regardless of whether or not they have knee issues. While the softer clutch pedal is specific to the manual transmission, the Sport Shift gets a benefit as well. I talked quite a bit in my last video about using the Sport Shift as best you can for smoother shifts. In addition to those do's, don'ts, tips, and tricks that I covered in that video, getting a twin plate clutch package can further improve shift quality. A common piece of feedback I get from my Sport Shift customers is that the Velocity AP clutch package helps improve shifts, and they're much happier with their cars overall for that improvement to the transmission. So, clutch life is better, manual cars no longer feel like tractors, the Sport Shift cars get better shifts, and that's all directly related to types of effects we can expect from a clutch package as it relates to the transmission. But another key reason it's so worthwhile to switch to a twin plate clutch package is for the lightweight flywheel that comes with it, and that affects the engine. One of the major complaints about the 4.3-liter V8 Vantage was its lack of power, but I don't think it's a fair criticism as the car's 380 horsepower was as much or more than most of its competitors when it was first released. The problem wasn't that the car didn't have enough power, it's that it took forever to get to that power. Step on the gas in low RPMs and not much happens. It takes a while for the engine to rev up and get into its power. And now, compared to cars currently on the market, the performance of those early V8 Vantages really leaves a lot to be desired. Luckily, there are a few ways to address that, and one of those is improving throttle response by using a lightweight flywheel. The basic concept here is pretty simple. The flywheel is bolted on the rear of the engine, and it spins with the engine as the engine revs. The heavier the flywheel, the more energy it takes to get it spinning, which means the harder it is for the engine to rev up. By reducing the weight of the flywheel, the engine can rev more freely, which means that the engine is more responsive. It's easy to spot a lightweight flywheel because you'll see a lot of material removed from this outer area right here, as this has the most effect on the flywheel's rotational mass, and therefore its momentum is easier to change, and so it will react more quickly to changes in throttle inputs. Basically, when you hit the gas, it will rev up more quickly, and when you let off the gas, it will spool down more quickly. In general. So what we get by switching to a lightweight flywheel is an engine that's going to be more responsive. It doesn't mean that it's going to just react more quickly. The practical application of it is if you're stopped at a dead stop, you're sitting still and you lay into the gas and you start going, it takes time to rev up the engine. And when you look at a dyno chart and you see the power climbing as the revs climb, you can replace that rev line with time. That means if it takes you 4 seconds to go from idle to 400 horsepower, it may only take you 3 seconds to go from idle to 400 horsepower. And when you're looking at that in a race, for example, if you get to 400 horsepower in 4 seconds and your opponent gets there in 3 seconds, well, that person's going to be walking away from you. So even if the power output stays the same, a lightweight flywheel or an engine in general that can respond more quickly and rev up more quickly and get into power more quickly is going to be a more effective engine. But it doesn't stop just there because the output isn't necessarily the same. You see, there's a difference between brake horsepower, which is measured at the engine, and wheel horsepower, which is measured at the wheels. And the difference is drivetrain loss. An engine puts out a certain amount of power, and typically about 15 to 18% of that power is lost going from the engine to the wheels because of drivetrain inefficiencies and having to move heavy things like this. Energy being used to rotate this is not getting to the ground. So by reducing the amount of energy that's required to move this, more power gets from the engine to the ground. So if we're looking at taking 400 horsepower and we lose 15 to 18% going to the wheels, if we reduce that loss, well, now we can get an extra, 5 to 15 horsepower to the wheels. It isn't a whole lot, but in addition to the faster power output from the engine, that quicker spool up, now we've got a more complete package for putting down power. And that's why clutch packages and lightweight flywheels are really effective, even if the numbers don't scream, hey, this is performance. One of the issues that can arise from a lightweight flywheel is that just as the engine revs up more quickly, it can lose revs more quickly as well when you let off the throttle. However, that's not really an issue with the V8 Vantage, as our cars have computer control over rev reduction during coast down. However, there is another potential downside to having a lightweight flywheel, and that's twitchy throttle at low speeds, especially in first gear. Now, just as the soft clutch pedal is something that's a bit divisive, this is another thing that can upset people at first. And again, it's something that tends to stop being an issue once you've retrained your muscle memory. You just have to realize that the engine is going to be more responsive to your throttle inputs, and it's more pronounced in low gears, especially first, so you need to relearn how to modulate the gas pedal. Once you're used to it, it's a non-issue, and it'll lend itself to the engine being more responsive overall and in general. While I don't consider the clutch pedal and sensitive first gear throttle to be negatives as their benefits outweigh their initial inconvenience, there is one last thing that's worth a warning, and that's the possibility of clutch chatter. Clutch chatter is a noise that can happen with multi-plate clutches while idling in neutral. So basically when you're sitting at a stoplight with the car not in gear. Not all people will get clutch chatter, but if you do, there are two ways to stop it. The easy temporary way is to just push in the clutch pedal. And it's an easy way to do it, but it's not the best thing to hold the clutch pedal in for too long, as it can cause some accelerated wear and tear. The other way is to get an engine tune that raises idle RPMs very slightly. I do have clutch chatter in my gray V8 Vantage with the Velocity AP twin plate clutch package, but most of the time I don't even notice it. I do have their engine tune, but I don't have it updated to raise the idle level because I wanted to see if it would happen in my own car. And when it did, I just didn't care enough to have the tune updated to raise the RPMs at idle to get rid of the clutch chatter. So it is what it is.
This was only 5 months ago. Sorry if this is hard for me to breathe in. I'm trying to breathe and I can't even see because it keeps fogging up. And I can't drink my drink and it's pissing me off. I hate quarantine.
The benefits of a twin plate clutch package are that you'll have a longer lasting clutch that can handle more abuse, and you'll have better engine response, and the clutch pedal is softer for those of us that prefer it. The downsides are that you may get clutch chatter, and the throttle response in first gear can be pretty sensitive, and some people may not like the softer clutch pedal if you have a manual. It may seem like when you're listing out those pros and cons that they're kind of tied, but in reality the pros are incredible and the cons are somewhat negligible by comparison. The common feedback I get from my customers is that their cars were transformed for the better when they switched over to a twin plate clutch and lightweight flywheel package, and I can say the same for my own car. And again, having had both and switched back and forth between them constantly during a 2-year period, I would never go back to a factory single plate clutch. So the two options I sell are the Velocity AP clutch package that I've mentioned in this video and the AMR clutch package. The Velocity AP setup uses an OEM V12 clutch and custom lightweight flywheel. They offer setups for both the manual and sport shift transmissions. Meanwhile, AMR is Aston Martin's in-house performance brand, and they have stated that the clutch package they offer is only meant for the manual transmission. Clutch service life is based on wear and tear, so it's hard to tell when a clutch will need to be replaced. If you do have a sport shift, you can get a bit reading using an AMDS, which is Aston Martin's proprietary diagnostic system. You'll need to go to a dealership or one of the handful of indie shops that have one of these AMDSs to get this bit reading done. If you have a manual, a test you can do is to drive very slow at basically very low speeds in a high gear and then step on the gas. If the engine revs up, it means your clutch is slipping and is going to need to be replaced soon. If the engine bogs down, it means your clutch is grabbing and is still good. I don't recommend doing this often, if at all, but it's a way to check. Okay, so there we go. Gear oil needs to be replaced every 4 years or 40,000 miles, whichever one comes first, and should be chosen based on what your needs are for how you use your car. When changing your gear oil, you should replace the washers for the drain and fill plugs and the O-ring for the transmission filter. Clutches need to be replaced based on wear and tear. You can keep the car the same and continue using the standard single plate clutch setup if that's what you have, or you can opt for a twin plate clutch and lightweight flywheel package that will come with a host of benefits, though they may take a little getting used to. And do not forget that clutch line. It's a very small thing that can have a major impact on how well your clutch can perform. As I said, the examples I've used in this video are the ones that I've used myself in my own cars, recommend my customers based on their needs, and that I sell through Red Pants. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel, and if you've learned something today, please give the video a like. And don't forget to check out www.redpants.lol for more Aston Martin parts and information. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.